Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a world-renowned neurosurgeon, the 17th Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's good to be back in Iowa where there are a lot of people with common sense. Although some of us who live in Florida sometimes say, why do people live in cold places like that? But we're very glad that you are here and that you are reflecting the sentiment of so many people in our country. I just want to start with a word of prayer. Kind Father in heaven, we're thankful that we live in a place where we can assemble ourselves together in peace and freedom, and we can call upon your name without consequences. We ask that you would give us wisdom and direction, that we may get this country back on the right track. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, first of all, I'm speaking as a concerned citizen, not as the head of a 501c3 think tank / do tank, the American Cornerstone Institute, because I'm very concerned about what's happening in our country. You've probably noticed our country seems to be on a downward spiral. You've also noticed that our country has pushed our faith away. And as we attack our faith and our families, our values also seem to be dissipating. And that's hurting us tremendously. And you know, the American dream is still alive and well, but many people have said that it isn't. They said that it's dead. There was a survey recently that showed the majority of people didn't believe that the American dream was still alive and well. But what's happened is there have been many people who have distorted the meaning of the American dream. They think that it means that somebody's going to give you something. That's not the American dream. The American dream is that you would live in a society where you have the opportunity through your own hard work and intellect to achieve, and that you could benefit from that and your family could benefit from that. That's what the American dream actually is. And some people say, well, it's not in place for certain people. You know, for minorities, for black people. You know, that's not true. Because if you know any families who settled here from Nigeria or Ghana, there's no wealth gap with those families. And if you go and you look at those families, you will discover that a bachelor's degree is the baseline, and they put a lot of value on family. So it really doesn't have anything to do with your skin color. And if you take traditional American black families who believe in education, hard work, and family, there's no wealth gap there either. So maybe they're looking at the wrong thing when they look at a person's skin color and say that that's what it's all about. That's what critical race theory, 1619 projects, all those things. And they take the most negative aspects of our society and they try to build something around that. Now, the fact of the matter is, when you look at America and you look at our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, there is a heck of a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. We have an amazing country. You know, my wife and I have visited 68 countries. We have lived overseas, and I can tell you there is no place like America. We are very fortunate to be here. But it didn't come about easily. Our founders were very wise people. You know, many people are trying to denigrate our founders and saying that they were horrible people and that they owned slaves and therefore we should get rid of them and get rid of any mention of them. What a bunch of garbage, you know? Anybody who knows anything about history knows that there is no society ever that didn't have to deal with slavery. And it didn't make us unique because we had slavery here. What did make us unique is that we had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to get rid of it. See, that's what they should teach our children. There's always been that sense of morality in this country that has driven us. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we went from a ragtag bunch of militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. It was because of those values, those beliefs, those cornerstones that made the difference. But, you know, Ben Franklin and all of those others who helped to formulate this country, they studied every governmental system in the world historically. They wanted to find the very best way to govern the people. And they were eclectics. They extracted the good stuff and got rid of the bad stuff. But even with all of that, when they were at that last Constitutional Convention in 1787, there was a lot of dissension. There was great fighting. In fact, it was so ruckus that the whole thing almost fell apart. And then the elder statesman, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, got up before the crowd and he said, "Gentlemen, stop. Let's get down on our knees and let's seek wisdom from God." And they knelt and they prayed. And they got up and they put together the Constitution of the United States of America. And when Ben Franklin came out of the building, he was asked, "Sir, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." If you can keep it. We've kept it for over 240 years, but we're as close to losing it right now as we have ever been. Because one of the things that made it such a solid system is our system of checks and balances. But if you don't have anything to balance off the executive branch like an objective Department of Justice, then the whole system kind of falls apart. And I think a lot of the people in this country understand that. And that's why you see increasing support for Donald Trump, because you see people trying to use the justice system to weaponize it to get rid of their major political opponent. And if we allow that to happen, this will not be America anymore. And I think the people actually realize that. So I'm proud to see that happening. But we can't just count on that. We have to be willing to really get out there and work very hard. And, you know, my American dream was to be a doctor. I loved medicine. From the time I was a little kid, the mission stories in church, Dr. Kildare, Dr. Casey, man, I was all over that. I even liked going to the doctor's office. I mean, I would gladly have a shot just so I could smell the alcohol swabs, you know. It was great. Maybe not a COVID shot, but but I had that dream, and it might have seemed unlikely coming from a broken home in the inner city with dire poverty. But my mother, who was the real hero, because she was one of many, many children in a large rural family, shifted around from home to home, never finished the third grade, got married at age 13, trying to escape dire poverty. They moved to Detroit. Years later, she discovered her husband was a bigamist. And there she was trying to raise 2 young sons by herself. You know, that's enough to depress anybody. But she had one very important thing. She had faith in God. And she prayed for wisdom because we were terrible students. I was probably the worst student you've ever seen. I remember once we were having an argument in the schoolyard about who was the dumbest kid in the school. And it wasn't a big argument because they all agreed it was me, but then somebody tried to extend the argument to who was the dumbest person in the world. And I said, there are billions of people in the world. And they said, yep, and you're the dumbest one. You know? But the worst thing was after recess, we had a math quiz. And I did not get along with math because the teacher thought that you should know your timetables. And as far as I was concerned, they were printed on the back of the little notebooks, and you could look it up if you needed it. But you couldn't do that during the test. So you had to pass your test to the person behind you. They would correct it, give it back. The teacher would call your name out loud, and you had to report your score out loud, which is great if you got 100 or a 95 or even a 90. Not so great if, like me, you got a 0 and just had an argument about who was the dumbest person in the world. And I knew they were going to laugh hysterically and say, I knew, see, we told you. So I started scheming. I said, I know what I'll do. When the teacher calls my name, I'll mumble. And the teacher will think I said one thing, and the girl behind me will think I said something else. So when she called my name, I said, 9. And she said, 9? Benjamin, you got 9 right. This is wonderful. I knew you could do it if you just applied yourself. Class, this is a banner. It had 30 questions, but she was just so excited. And finally, the girl behind me couldn't take it any longer. And she stood up and she said, he said none. Well, the kids were rolling in the aisles. And if I could have disappeared into thin air and never be heard from again in the history of the world, I would gladly have done so. But I couldn't. So I had to act like it didn't bother me. But it did bother me. It bothered me a lot. Not enough to make me study, but it bothered me. But my mother was so concerned, she prayed for wisdom. And God gave her the wisdom. And that wisdom was to turn off the TV and make us read books. And we were not enthusiastic about that. In today's world, we would have called social services. And her friends were all saying, you can't make boys stay in the house and read books. They'll grow up and they'll hate you. And I would overhear her friends, and I would say, you know, they're right, Mother. But we still had to do it. But, you know, after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books because we were desperately poor. But between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere. I could be anybody. I could do anything. I could escape. And as I read about entrepreneurs and engineers and scientists and surgeons and explorers, I began to understand a very important thing, and that is that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not some circumstance. And I got to the point where if I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. And in a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And all those students who used to laugh at me and call me dummy were coming to me and saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious. But it sure felt good to say that. But, you know, I had the same brain when I was at the bottom of the class that I had at the top of the class. Had a different attitude. And isn't that what it's about, our attitude? Isn't that what changes and makes us decide to excel or to be satisfied with not excelling? But that should be our own choice. And one of the things that was wonderful for me in working in the Trump administration was working with him because he believed that a rising tide floats all boats. He didn't believe in picking this group over this group. And what a difference that made. You know, I had a lot of conflicts with some of the people in Congress, but Trump always had my back. You know, when it came to women's shelters, for instance, you know, the transgender group insisted that transgenders be able to go into the women's shelters and sleep with them. And I just couldn't see that, because why are they called women's shelters if they're for anything other than women? A lot of those women were trying to escape from abusive situations with men, and they said they would rather sleep in the forest than to be in there with one of these people. And, you know, I'm a live and let live person. You can do what you want to do. But I'm also a scientist. And you know what scientists know? They know that if you have 2 X chromosomes, you're a woman. And if you have an X and a Y, you're a man. End of story. You know? And it's time for us to bring some of that logic back. And that's why I had a good time working with President Trump, because he was logical. In fact, when I dropped out, it was easy for me to support him because in terms of our philosophies, we were identical. We had different personalities, but but it was very easy to work with him. And, you know, at HUD, one of the initial things was that they were fiscally in the dark. They had not had an audit in 8 years. It is a requirement that every federal agency have an audit once a year. You couldn't do an audit because there were so many material defects. That's how bad it was. And we were able to recruit a very talented individual who was a senior partner at Ernst & Young. It required a lot of arm twisting, but he finally came. And you probably noticed about 1.5 years into the Trump administration, there were no more stories about fiscal mismanagement at HUD. You didn't hear about the billions of dollars disappearing. It stopped. And we believe that that was something that would be possible everywhere. HUD is probably the best run of the agencies at this point if they haven't ruined it yet. But it is possible to do. The other thing that was so important to do is Trump asked every one of the cabinet secretaries to get rid of 2 regulations for every regulation that they enacted. And we were so enthusiastic about that. In the beginning, we got rid of 22 for everyone. And, you know, it continued. And at HUD, we got rid of over 2,000 regulations and sub-regulations, which, and that in turn made it much easier to accomplish things. For instance, there's a group of young people from Ohio who came to us. They had aged out of foster care. And they were telling us about the fact that 20,000 young people age out of foster care every year. At least a quarter of them end up homeless. A larger number than that end up in even worse situations. And our people were so inspired. And with all those regulations out of the way, within 4 months, they created the FYI program, Foster Youth to Independence. We were giving out grants so that they would have an apartment, but not only that, but the wraparound services that you would need. Because can you imagine being 18 years old and being on your own with no support? And that has been very successful. And there are a lot of other programs that I was able to do. The opportunity zones, we were fortunate to be able to lead those in the HUD because utilizing tax incentives, we encourage corporate America to invest in those areas that were the most deprived. And it was expected that we would be able to attract $100 billion in 10 years. Well, in 2 years before COVID hit, we already had $75 billion. And that's how successful that program was. And then several self-sufficiency programs. And then one of the ones that I was most proud of was the mustard seed program. Because who takes care, before there was all these government agencies, of the homeless and the widows and the disabled? It was the churches that did that. So we said, churches are not the enemies. The churches are our friends. And let's look for the churches that are doing wonderful things in their community, and let's support those efforts so that they can grow. And the president was fully behind that, and there was just wonderful examples all over the country of how that worked. And also being able to give grants again to faith-based organizations that dealt with homelessness. The previous Obama administration had made it very hard to give a grant to faith-based oriented help situations. We were able to reverse that. Now, of course, the Biden administration's come in and reimposed all those rules. So that's why it's important that we get back in there again so that we can help those people who really need to be helped. Because the fact of the matter is, we, the American people, are not each other's enemies. And we have people who are trying to make us into enemies by driving wedges in between us on the basis of race, age, income, gender, religion, political affiliation, you name it, driving wedges, dividing and conquering. And I hate to say it, but it's effective. It's working well. And we have to be the ones who fight against it. Each one of us has the possibility of being like a missionary. And we need to talk to the people in our spheres of influence. You know, they always say you can talk about anything except religion and politics. That's exactly what we need to be talking about. Because what happens is, people just stand in the corner and they look down at their shoes and they hope nobody calls them a nasty name or tries to cancel them. That doesn't work. That doesn't work when your country is on the precipice. And if we're deciding, are we going to go Marxist and socialist, or are we going to make America great again? We have to be the ones who decide that, but we have to be active. We have to be courageous. One of the things that I discovered when I was running, going to all 50 states, to the largest cities, the smallest little hamlets, and it was very encouraging, discovered that the American people, for the most part, have common sense. What they don't have is courage. And that's what we have got to develop. People don't want to be hassled. They don't want to get in any trouble. But we're going to be in the biggest trouble imaginable if we go socialist. If that happens, everything changes dramatically, almost overnight. You look at Venezuela. You know, it was the most prosperous nation in South America. And I had been there on a number of occasions. Beautiful hotels and resorts and museums and shopping areas. The biggest issue that the people argued about was whether or not they were the most beautiful people in the world. That was their issue. Look what's happened to them almost overnight when they went socialist. Massive homelessness. They're now the poorest country. All kinds of unrest, people fleeing the country, trying to get any place else. Think about that. And don't think that it couldn't happen in this country, because it can. And it is the will of many people to fundamentally change us into a situation where you have a country that is of, for, and by the government instead of a country that is of, for, and by the people. We're the ones who have to change that. No one else can. And we have to recognize that God uses all kinds of people. I hear people saying, I don't like Trump. You know, he irritates me. He says things that are offensive. Well, tell me this. Would you rather have somebody who maybe talks a little rough, but has excellent policies that work well for you? Think about it. That beats the heck out of having somebody who maybe says the right things, if they can find the words, and has policies that are nothing but destructive. And you think about when Trump was in office, we had energy independence. We were moving to the point where we were taking natural liquefied gas and exporting it and gaining enormous amounts of money. We buffed up our military, which was in terrible shape. Half of our airplanes didn't even fly. We got the economy roaring. We had the lowest unemployment that we've ever had. We had a secure border. I mean, all the things that are problematic now, we had taken care of, and we were on the way to making it a whole lot better. I think even a lot of people on the left are starting to realize that. But the thing that could get in the way is election integrity matters. And we have to start insisting on election integrity. We can't accept things that are unacceptable, like officials who come up at the last minute and say the signatures don't have to match, the addresses don't have to match. It's okay for us to stuff all these ballots in here, all from the same address. You know, stuff like that. We can't accept that. We can't accept it when they say, you got to stand way over there if you're a ballot monitor. You can't actually see what's going on. Why do we accept stuff like that? If you continue to accept that, it will continue to happen. And if that's going on, it doesn't matter what the issues are. It doesn't matter what the records show. You'll always wind up with the same result. It'll always be questionable, and then at the last minute, just enough votes will come in to do what needs to be done. It's the pattern that we've come to recognize over the course of time. So my point being that you have to get involved. You have to get out there and volunteer. There are cards, commitment cards that you can sign. You can be precinct captains and leaders. You can work on phone banks. You can do a whole host of things. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your family. Definitely come out to caucus. And you can go to ia.donaldjtrump.com and get the scoop on all the different things and ways that you can become involved. But it makes a difference for our country. And the last thing I want to say, I could talk all night about all kinds of wonderful things, but I want us to recognize that this is a country that was founded on Judeo-Christian values. Think about that. We were taught to love your neighbor, Not to cancel your neighbor if they have a different yard sign or you disagree with. Okay, that doesn't work. And we learned early on when there were little communities all over the place, separated from other communities by 50 or 100 miles, not only did they survive, but they thrived because they understood the common good, what works for everybody. If it was harvest time and Mr. Johnson fell out of the tree and broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops. No questions asked, not because he was a Democrat or a Republican, but because he was your neighbor. You know, that was one of the things that characterized the great strength of our nation. And when we were involved in World War II, think about the courage that existed there. Think about the young women who went into the factories and built more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than anybody could imagine. Think about all the ones that lost their lives in the munitions factories from the explosions. Did that stop them? No, it did not. Think about all the young men, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, many of them lying about their age so they could fight for our country. Think about D-Day as they approached the shores of Normandy. Under heavy fire, 100 bodies laying dead on the sand, 1,000 bodies dead in the sand. Were the others afraid? Did they turn back? Yes, they were afraid. No, they did not turn back. They stepped over the dead bodies and they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases that they would never see their family or their loved ones again. Why did they do that? Obviously not for themselves. They did it for you, and they did it for me, so that we could live in peace and freedom. And now it's our turn. It's our turn to get involved. It's our turn to make America great again. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to have a picture with Dr. Carson, please start a single file line on the left-hand side of the stage, and we are happy to assist you with that. Thank you.